Can you hear me? Great. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for making time to come to this exciting side event. And I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome you, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies in the room. Thank you so much. And I would like to take this opportunity before I delve into explaining what we're going to do for the rest of the day to just welcome the members of the panel who I'll introduce individually. And I'll also like to take this opportunity to recognize a member of the executive committee to actually make an intervention before we start. Please, Mr. Khavhagali.
Thank you, Ms. Honda. And good afternoon, colleagues. We are meeting here in Bonn under the COP23, being led by Fiji. So it's a great feeling to be here. I'm certainly you're all excited to hear about the Warsaw International Mechanism. Certainly you're interested to hear about what we're going to be discussing about today. So thank you very much for honoring this event. The other, by the way, announcement is that when we were busy planning this event, something popped out, and when they chose the date for this particular event, and I realized, oh, by the way, that's going to be on my birthday. So today's my birthday. Now, drilling deep into the real issues why we are meeting at this point, allow me to just say we just walked out of a meeting that we were busy working on the Warsaw International Mechanism, also with the different parties, which obviously we are working and considering the report that we have done as the executive committee. However, I'm just here to give you a brief engagement in terms of the mechanism, and also leave the rest of the discussion to the panel, and also your interactive engagements for this will be very important. Welcome to the second event for the executive committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. We know by now that the climate change impacts from rapid onset storms and floods are actually ranging and also causing a lot of process in terms of desertification, sea level rise, all affecting many countries and many communities across the globe. And obviously that the impact is different depending on the country's capacity to be able to respond, to avert, minimize, and also address loss and damage. In this regard, I think it's important for the international community to have a look at the work ranging from the preemptive planning and putting contingency measures into place in order to enhance the resilience of the most vulnerable. These efforts requires a suite of resources such as innovative thinking, knowledge, expertise, technical capacity, collaboration, and partnership in terms of schemes, and also finance. We hope that this side event will help us all advance discussions on the intersection on two most important issues, risk financing and also slow onset events. I'm sure we're going to hear more from our distinguished guests or distinguished panel members here today, and we also look forward to an active and interactive engagement. There are two most important things that we are hoping for from the floor. We want to find a way on how we can foster insightful thinking on financial instruments to address risk of loss and damage associated with slow onset events, and discuss innovative collaboration and partnership to enhance action and support in that manner. I'm sure most of you who are here today, you are aware of the mechanism, the Warsaw International Mechanism, and the work of its executive committee. Let me briefly take you through the background. The mechanism was established at COP19 as the main vehicle under the convention to promote the implementation of approaches to address loss and damage in a comprehensive, integrated, and coherent manner. Parties also established the executive committee in order to guide the implementation of the functions of the particular mechanism. You will see the three functions of the mechanisms, which are to enhance knowledge, understanding, enhance dialogue, coordination, coherence, and synergies, and also enhance action and support. With this short introduction of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, let me provide some background about this side event today. Some of you may be aware that the Executive Committee invited Standing Committee on Finance, another body under the convention, to discuss financial instruments that address the risk of loss and damage associated with the adverse effects of climate change at the annual forum in 2016. The two-day forum identified a number of gaps and challenges. This side event builds upon a few key challenges and gaps reported from the 2016 SCF forum and focus on how they could be able to overcome such challenges. You can see the challenges and gaps as they've been identified. We look at the issues around existing financial instruments that are not available at all. Secondly, the risks of loss and damage may exceed national capacities. And obviously, we also need to look and examine the existing financial instruments that may not be enough in many countries. Current efforts are mostly directed towards extreme events and rapid onset events. However, it's important for us to understand what are the major gaps that still exist with regard to addressing the slow onset events. And obviously, the insurance sector can contribute to the discussion and support the development of new instruments in this field on the basis of its experience and data utilized for existing instruments. These challenges and gaps also gave the framing of the questions of the panel discussion today. It's important for us to understand that we will be working on this together as partners. Let me stop here and over to our colleague, our facilitator, Musonda, who will provide more detail about the structure of the event. And I look forward to the outcomes of this particular discussion. Thank you very much, Musonda. Please welcome.
Great. So before I actually even start, I'd like to call Laura to just explain a slight technicality of what we're going to do. It's very exciting. Laura, over to you.
Hi everyone, my name is Lauren and I'm one of the loss and damage interns here at the Secretariat. And I have 3 minutes to explain to you what Slido is and work you through an interactive example. So has anyone in here used Slido before or have maybe heard of it? Raise your hands. Okay, so a few of you are familiar, that's great. For the rest of you who might not know much about it, Slido is an audience management tool, which basically means that it allows you, the audience, to engage with our panel and our facilitator throughout the side event by asking questions that you might have, by responding to questions, and you can also like other people's questions that you think are really good and that you would like to see answered throughout the event. It is super easy to use. You don't even have to download an app. You just go to your web browser on your phone, your computer, your tablet, whatever device you might have, and you type in slido.com. And that will take you to the main page, and you'll see a place where it asks you for an event code. And our event code should be displayed on the screens here, and it is #SOEs. You simply type in that code, and it's going to take you to our event page. And that is where you can ask questions and respond and like other people's questions as well. And my favorite feature is it can be anonymous. So if you think you have a dumb question, which I'm sure you don't, you can do it anonymously. And you can also put your name in as well if you do want people to know who you are. So now that you have an idea of what Slido is and a little bit about how it works, I actually want you all to go ahead and get your phones out, get your tablets out, get your laptops out. I don't care what it is, but go ahead and get it out and let's work through an example together so you get the hang of it. I'm going to do it with you as well. So you open up your web browser. I'm opening up Safari right now, and I am typing in slido.com and search. All right, mine's loading. It's a little bit slow today. Okay, so now I'm on the main page, and it's asking me for the event code. So I'm typing in SOEs and go. And it's loading again, very slowly. Okay, so once you get to the main page, you'll see two tabs on the top. One is for questions and one is for polls. Polls should be the one highlighted right now. We already have a question ready for you to answer. Where do you come from? I come from the United States, if you couldn't tell. And let's see, United States. Send. And you should see the responses popping up on the screen. And when you ask a question as well, you'll also see it come up on the screen. And once we do select a question to highlight during our event, we will highlight it on the screen so you know which question we're talking about. So now that you have the hang of it, hopefully you realize how easy it is. We really want you to engage throughout the event by utilizing this tool. So with that being said, I'm going to hand it back over to our facilitator, and we're going to get the side event started. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Oh, how exciting. I've seen France, Denmark, Kenya, Vanuatu, Switzerland. Fantastic. I'm super excited. So let's begin. A few weeks ago, we saw some very devastating events in the Caribbean, in America. Hurricanes devastating places, livelihoods, settlements, and everything. These extreme events are changing the way we live and the way we exist. However, there's something even a little bit more sinister that underlies what happens all of this. The slow onset events that take time to kind of manifest. Droughts, land degradation, desertification. Suddenly, we realize there's no water. And we haven't realized it's taken a while to actually get to a place where we have no water. Correct? Great. So, we are all aware of these events. So today we're going to talk about these slow onset events and really breaking new ground, trying to get a better understanding. And we have an amazing panel of experts here who are going to tell us about what are the financing mechanisms. We know that obviously for extreme events, there's been fantastic financing mechanisms to engage and deal with all of this. So I want to say that I'm sure you've all seen that there was a photo thing going on. Can we get some pictures from the photos? Are they loaded? I'm sure some of you are actually in those pictures, and we have them on the posters over there. So we ask people to just go over to our booth and stand there and make a sign and say, what are you doing? So to just give you some responses. Somebody says, never eat meat. Eat vegan. I'm vegetarian. What solutions can we change? Communication, for example. I raise awareness through music. Very exciting. What does somebody do around research and knowledge? I research issues related to immunity and biodiversity. Oh, very interesting. Engagement. I engage with indigenous peoples in sacred rituals. Wow. There was somebody from the Zanaga Foundation saying that they build PV plants for schools. So it's very interesting. So you can see some of the pictures over there. So our event this afternoon is in 3 parts. We are going to begin with part 2 that actually does look at financial instruments. The 3rd part is going to look at partnerships and relationships. The last 4th part is where you engage and where we get some conversation going and really have a discussion in terms of, okay, what is our take-home message? What are we going to do? And I'm sure people in this room have been engaged in the loss and damage discussions for quite a long time and for a number of years now. So we are all very much aware that the Standing Committee of Finance obviously has raised profile and discussions around slow onset events and discussing financial mechanisms and discussions around how do we finance these things that take a long while to manifest in our lives. I will begin by introducing 2 panelists, the first 2 panelists that are going to discuss the issue of financial instruments. I start with Mr. Simone Quatrini, who works for the United Nations Convention on Combating Biological Diversity, desertification. But it is related, is it not? Indeed. But you're combating desertification, a very critical issue. Simone has been leading a program at the UNCCD since 2014 that has been focused on the development of a really fantastic and exciting land degradation neutral, let me even find the wording. The Land Degradation Neutrality Fund. How many have heard about it? I see 3 hands. This is state-of-the-art financing mechanism. He's going to tell us all about it. Mr. Grammenos Mastrojeni is from the Italian government, an expert in his own right, a diplomat who has different hats and has been responsible for working within the environment and science development of the Italian government. He also sits on a panel I sit in. He's a steering committee member of the Mountain Partnership and many, many, many other things. So I would like to start with you, Simone, and really for you to tell us how this neutrality fund mechanism, how it works. You've got 5 minutes to really razzle-dazzle us, give us ideas, give us an interesting sort of perspective on what it is. You know, how does it actually relate to the discussion at hand on slow onset events? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Musonda, for this nice introduction. If if I had known that there were photographers taking pictures out there, I would have gone with my blackboard saying I spent 20 years of my life developing ideas for financing instruments for combating desertification. I joined the UNCCD in 1999, and I've been involved ever since on this challenge. So as Musonda just mentioned, the latest project that I've coordinated since 2014 is the development of the Land Degradation Neutrality Fund, which is developed as a public-private partnership, bringing together investors from both the public sector side and investors from the private sector side to pool capital that would then be used for financing projects and activities on the ground that address the issues of desertification, land degradation, and drought. So more specifically, this fund will finance projects that, on the one hand, prevent land degradation from happening or from aggravating over time, and on the other hand, support the restoration or rehabilitation of degraded lands. Just to give you an idea of the scale of the challenge that we are facing, we are losing 12 million hectares of land every year to the process of land degradation. 12 million hectares is basically the equivalent of 1/3 of Germany, and this adds to already a stock, so to speak, of degraded land of about 2 billion hectares, which is equivalent to the entire South American continent. So in order to address any issues of this magnitude, we really need financial instruments that are able to mobilize a huge amount of resources. Obviously, this is something that the private sector or the public sector alone cannot do, and therefore this is where we came to this idea of a blended finance vehicle. I'm not sure if you can see the slide. It's fairly small fonts, but essentially I wanted to highlight here, since I only have a couple of minutes, some essential features or characteristics of this fund that might be applicable and of interest to addressing other slow onset events. The one I want to start with is actually the capital structure of the fund, which is illustrated in this chart. So essentially, there is a capital structure that consists of junior shares, which are on the lower part of the chart on the upper corner, which is where we expect donors, so public sector funders, to invest their capital. And these junior shares basically provide a cushion or a guarantee or a protection for the capital that will be invested by other typologies of investors into senior notes. So this could be development finance institutions, impact investors, and private investors, including, for example, pension funds. So this is a very important feature because the protection that is ensured by this structure is in itself an incentive for private sector to accept, to invest the money into these risky activities. The second characteristic is the time span that is required to actually implement projects that deliver a systematic change and a transformational change. We are talking of projects that could be for 30 years, 40 years, even more. So of course, the time dimension is critical and it has to be addressed in order to be able to respond to the risk and return expectations of the various investors. I would also like to mention another important factor that we are facing, which is the liquidity factor. So of course, in order for funds of this type that deal with these long-term issues, it is extremely important to be able to provide a market which enables the investors to exit from their investment at a certain point in time, because there are not many investors that are willing to be locked into the same product for 30, 40 years. Those of you who are familiar with the capital markets know that investors typically look at a very short term horizon, 1.5 years maximum. So the good news is that from a financial engineering point of view, and this is just an example, there are solutions that can be undertaken, that can be applied to match the long-term tenor of the underlying investments with the various risk and return profiles of the investors. So I think, Musunda, I will stop here because this could be a very long talk, but I'd be happy to come back if there are questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that intervention. Without further ado, I just want to hand over to Grammenos for his intervention as well. Please, thank you.
Thank you so much. I come from Italy, which is a country that has been affected by slow onset dynamics directly and throughout the region it sits in. So we had to start thinking about solutions a long time ago. Well, we're talking about finance, and finance sometimes tends to live in its own world, and it's only normal because it plugs on business practices that are well established. But in this case, finance becomes viable if business is viable. You see before you the 2030 agenda. When it was adopted, the question mark was, is it too ambitious? This is a framework for a new economy for the whole of the world. It could well work as guidelines for public action, but then it will not really work if it doesn't become an operational way also for private actions. And the question is, are the 2030 agenda values marketable? Are people inclined to pay for these values? And it is important in what we're saying because in contrasting slow onset events, it is about protecting these values in front of a modifying environment. Let us define what we're talking about. When you talk about extreme weather events, you talk about a more energetic climate that directly impacts people and structures. When you talk about a slow onset event, you talk about the impact of a modifying climate on the rest of the ecosystem. So, connected to the ecosystem, there are a lot of values that make societies viable in certain fragile regions. And the question is, to have a viable finance on them, we need to have a viable business to protect them, but then we can ask ourselves, are customers prepared to pay for these values? Are customers prepared to pay for gender equality? Are customers prepared to pay for the forests, etc.? And sadly, the answer is no. We had a very important lesson from the adventure of palm oil. When we started talking about palm oil, the first campaigns were pointing out to the fact that palm oil was destroying nature, let's put it this way, simply. Did it move anything? A little bit, not much. The situation changed completely when the discourse became, it's harming you. So, if combating slow onset event is about preserving the environment, and if preserving the environment is a value that customers are not yet prepared on, should we despair? No, but we have to bear clearly in mind one difference. Customers are not prepared to pay for an abstract, even though it is very concrete, we know it here, value as the viability of the environment, but they are prepared to pay for the services that a viable environment will provide to us. So, combating slow onset events, we can take two ways. One is to build protective infrastructure to cope with an environment that is going to die or become dysfunctional. Another way is to take this environment and protect it in a way that it stays vital and still provides its fruits. The two lines, of course, are complementary, but the more we act to protect the viability and the vitality of the environment, the less we will need to spend on structures. And again, the question is, but are customers prepared to pay for that? Yes, when the fruit of the environment that we are losing is concrete, and also yes, when making the ecosystem viability and opportunity for income becomes tangible. We can do that. There are many examples. Degraded lands recovery is one, but there are others. I will just tell you a story. There is a small archipelago out of Africa called São Tomé and Príncipe. It is a pearl of biodiversity because it has forests. These forests were threatened by various factors, including climate change. What would we do? Shift to another economy because forests are not there anymore? We could create the interest of communities there to protect their own forests, and there it becomes effective. How did we do it? We recovered a traditional cultivation of cocoa inside the forest. This kind of cocoa is more expensive than regularly cultivated cocoa because it has to be labored by hand inside the forest. Where did finance and commerce plug in? We created the market for it. In only 5 minutes, we cannot give too many examples, but in our experience, and we are deploying our efforts in many areas of the world, the secret is this one: make a viable environment an opportunity for income and development, and you will enroll societies as a whole into protecting their own environment, even in face of a changing climate. There is just one small difficult point, and it is that if what we have to protect is the viability of ecosystem services, they do not have many times a worldwide scale. They are territorial. So we need large-scale investments, but we need them to be deployable on small-scale projects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grammenos. So, we have to move to the next part, and I can see some very, very exciting. Our colleagues in the back, please. Thank you. So, I'm going to introduce the second set of my colleagues sitting on the panel. The first presenter is going to be Manjeet Dhakal, who is a national of Nepal and an advisor to the Least Developed Country Group based in Kathmandu, and he is a climate policy advisor for the LDC group. And I also want to present my other colleague sitting right next to him. His name is Espen Ronneberg, who is a special climate advisor for SPREP, which stands for Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Program, based in the Pacific. My colleagues are going to answer this question. So we're talking about risks of loss and damage and how these may exceed the national capacity. So can you just give us an idea? First, starting with Manjeet, how can we work together to enhance support, especially at the national level, in terms of how we deal with these efforts? Manjeet, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me take you to the Himalaya, the highest peak of the world, the mountain where I'm from. This is the picture taken, this is the infographics made by OCHA, the Office of the United Nations Office of the Humanitarian Affairs, from the recent flooding that we have experienced in South Asia. And this is the region where we have the Hindu Kush Himalaya, and which are also regarded as the water tower of the world, of that region, providing the drinking water and the other water facility to about 1.3 billion population and 1/5 of the population of the world. In the first picture, you can see the red spot, which are the districts which were affected by the flood. And then in the blue color, you can see the area where the flooding has impacted. Here, you can also see the political border of the country, Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and then the India. And the picture clearly shows us this kind of extreme events or other similar example with the other slow onset event doesn't comply with any political border. The impact that we have seen coming from the Himalayas or any kind of flood in the lowland in Nepal, the impact doesn't remain only within the one country, but goes beyond, and that's what we have seen in the recent example. The other example, the other picture, the other infograph that we have is from the numbers that we have seen in specific only about Nepal. 1.7 million people were affected. 461,000 people were displaced. And then there are numbers related to how many people were dead, how many people lost their house, how many people were injured. And this is not the final number. There were institutions that were working at that time, providing real-time updates. So this is the example that was taken from that specific date. You can also see on the last row the funding, where the plays were made from some of the neighboring country. And just to highlight, linking with the support, these are the ad hoc arrangement provided by some of the country in the region. We don't have such setup to address the needs of the country. Some of these countries are the least developed country to address their need, and there are no setup, the institutional arrangement that helps the country in terms of preparedness or in terms of the planning process or when the extreme event happens. So whatever we have been doing as of now in most of these cases are the ad hoc arrangement, the event happened and then the country comes together. There are other examples related to the drought, the very extreme situation that has been faced in most of the region in India, in Bangladesh, even in Nepal, the people who are based in the rain-fed agriculture. So we can go on taking this example. Under the 1.5 degree scenario, if the temperature will rise only up to the 1.5 degree, the glaciers in the Himalayas and on the eastern region of this Hindu Kush Himalaya has been projected by the end of the century, half of this glacier will be shrinked. So this shows a very difficult situation in the future, how the impact is growing, and then the number that I gave earlier about this Himalaya that serve as a source of the water supply for the huge population in that region is going to be impacted. What I just want to focus is the importance of collaboration. And it's the collaboration not only among the institution within the country, but also the institution across the border. And that's some of the difficult thing that we have been dealing in the region, because it doesn't link only with the institution within the country that looks after the disaster or climate related extreme events, because there are activities that has to be taken forward through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which takes time for the coordination, and such event doesn't have such we don't have the luxury of time when the event happens. So But when we talk about the collaboration, it's not only the collaboration after the events, but also about the institution to work together in terms of knowledge generation. There are some in the region. Also, the institution to be involved, working together for the preparedness. Also, to address the issue in the longer term, so that such event doesn't happen, and also in terms of the immediate response after the event. So there should be the collaboration at all these levels, and when the country comes up with the planning, the most important part now here lies about the support, and then we heard earlier about some exciting example and about how the support can be mobilized. Few example, even though the country with the very least capacity, I'll just take an example of Bangladesh and Nepal. Bangladesh has a trust fund for climate change, and then the government itself mobilized the funding and has been taking number of initiatives to address the slow onset event and other extreme event in the country. I represent the Environment Trust Fund in Nepal, where we have been collecting funding with the nominal charge to the every liter of the petrol and diesel that has been used in the country, and we have been exploring possibility how those funding could be mobilized. But very important to note here, these are some of the initiatives taken by some of this country with the least capacity, with the very limited resources. And here lies the important role of the international support to be mobilized. And including the international support, I think it's also very important to have further thoughts in terms of the other sources, other appropriate sources which can be mobilized here. And I think we will hear about some examples here. I'm seeing Julian here, so she has been doing some exciting work here on this regard. So it would be good to hear more from Julian on that point. And also, I think it's very important also to mobilize further support to the work that the WIM has been doing in terms of collaboration and bringing together this institution. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Clearly, we can hear from that example and just looking at that picture that these events are no respecter of borders. And I think we need to recognize that, and why capacity is really important within the sort of in-country and transboundary as well. I would like to pass on to Espen. You're coming from a small island developing state context. So how do you think that we can actually work together in terms of enhancing the capacities and supporting countries in that respect? Please. 5 minutes.
Thank you. I'll try my best. First of all, slow onset as well as extreme events are really making themselves evident in the Pacific. And as my backdrop, I'm using the flyer for a Pacific side event on Sunday. The most recent cyclone season in the Pacific have given us some storms that we have not really seen before. But at the same time, slow onset events are also having an impact. We've been seeing droughts and king tides wreaking havoc on coastal agriculture and ecosystems. But we're not standing still, of course. The countries in the region, and supported by the regional agencies such as mine, work is progressing on different slow onset events. We have begun an ocean acidification monitoring project. And there's also some interesting ecosystem-based adaptation work looking at seagrasses, which apparently are able to reduce very localized acidification. I'm not saying that we're going to go and plant seagrasses everywhere, but certainly for some ecosystems and some locations, protecting the seagrass beds is actually quite an important step for ocean acidification as one of the many slow onset risks that we're facing in the Pacific. We are learning, though, that there will be compounding impacts of different climate change effects. We can't prepare for impacts individually or by themselves. We have to look at it from a multidisciplinary and multi-stakeholder, multi-risk approach. It's not sufficient to simply monitor the sea level rise. There's a whole bunch of other things that we also need to monitor, and we need to understand how they interact with each other under different circumstances, which is one of the key lessons from the recent cyclone season. We also see how some of the events are impacting several more countries than we've seen in the past. Cyclone Pam, although the big headline stories came out of Vanuatu, it did have serious impacts in Kiribati, Tuvalu, and New Caledonia. And this puts a stress on how the region works together to assist each other, and how also international support is deployed. So we need to be aware of the longer term and how this will play out in the longer term. We'll probably have quite immense fatigue to try and adapt when the next Category 5 cyclone just wipes it all out for you. In looking at the way forward, coming from a region where regional cooperation has a very long history, working together in one team is a very important aspect of how we tackle climate change. We basically, on the one hand, we need support for what we're already doing at the regional and national level, but we also need support for some of the new kind of emerging slow onset issues. On ocean acidification, we only have 3 permanent stations in the whole of the Pacific. If you know how big the Pacific Ocean is, you'd realize that that's not anywhere near what we need. So we're looking at getting greater coverage in terms of observations, and also better cooperation with ships of opportunity to give us samples along the routes of transportation and so forth. But again, it's not sufficient. We need technical cooperation and capacity supplementation. We've been doing this through what we call the Regional Technical Support Mechanism, whereby countries in the region could apply for technical assistance on a rapid basis, and it would be deployed for some very specific technical work that they needed to be done. Unfortunately, we ran out of funds in June. Another impact on this is, of course, that US 21 million have been withdrawn from the Pacific by a certain donor, which will have a serious impact on the climate change work that we're doing. So we're scrambling at the moment to try and figure out how we can plug that particular hole. But as always, hope trumps these types of reactions. We're also looking at some of the other things that we need to do in the multidisciplinary sense. There are lots of pieces to the puzzle. Early warning systems is one thing, and that's one of the reasons why the ocean acidification project is so important. We also need to have rapid response, though. A regional insurance mechanism has been discussed recently, and I'm hoping we'll hear some more about that, but I can definitely answer some questions on how we are progressing on that work. While we have disaster insurance on a regional basis, it doesn't cover everything. So we need to look into the climate change insurance aspect. These can all be ingredients that we need to have. Since this is a Fiji COP, thought I'd use the analogy of a dish that's very popular in Fiji. It's a Chinese dish called combination long and short soup. It's combination because it's chicken and shrimp, and it's long and short because it's long noodles and dumplings. So in order to get to the bottom of how a most reasonable approach to slow onset events and the financing and the technical support that's needed, we do need to have a very strong combination of different ingredients. Because when you look at some of the impacts that we've been seeing, if you take the situation of the atoll countries, of which I'm very, very familiar, and Yokwe to the Marshallese delegation, in atolls, they've been, because of El Nino, some of the atolls have been drying out, but also sea level rise have impacted on the freshwater lenses. This is pure physics. When the sea level rises, it pushes the freshwater water lenses up, and that will dissipate them. At the same time, sea level rise has caused wave overtopping and saline intrusion. So you have a triple impact for the atolls. So what we need to see is some innovation and adaptation of different techniques and technologies that can help cope with these types of circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I had to ring my yoga bell. So that will be a signal that we're almost getting there. So now we have the last two panel members, exciting presenters as well. So we're moving now to the final bit of our panel discussion before we now pass it on to the audience. I'm seeing really exciting questions coming on. I'm very looking forward to these discussions. I want to introduce Dr. David Simmons, who comes from an organization called Willis Towers Watson Capital, based out of London, and is the managing director of this organization with over 35 years experience looking at reinsurance, insurance experience. And I also want to introduce our lady at the very end, since we had to sandwich the men in the middle. Julianne Richards, well over 14 years experience of working on climate change issues, and in the last 3-4 years has been also working on loss and damage. So the question to both of you is really, how can the insurance sector, or maybe other sectors, really explore and contribute to the discussion around supporting development of new instruments around slow onset events? I want to start with you, David, please.
Okay, if you will indulge me, I wish I had a food analogy like Espen had, but I thought I haven't. I can talk a little bit about actually how the insurance industry and mechanism has changed in my career, and actually even go back even before my long career, back 300 years ago. 300 years ago, we had a big problem in Europe, which is urban fire, right? Tens of thousands of people died a year. That problem was largely cured by the insurance mechanism. That was actually beginning to understand what risks were, actually how you could build properties better to withstand risks, which led to building codes, and how to respond to events when they did occur, which of course led to fire brigades. Okay, so actually now, within decades, actually, the problem was controlled and contained. 30 years ago, which is more or less at the start of my career, a little bit into it, to be honest with you, we had a big problem in the global catastrophe insurance industry. We were bust. We had no money, right? It had gone. Why were we bust? Because we didn't understand our business. It's quite extraordinary. We didn't understand the risk we were covering. We didn't understand how quickly when they could happen, how big they could be. We didn't understand where our risks were. I used to work for a firm that covered windstorm in the UK. 80% of the property we were covering was in one small town in Yorkshire, in theory, which is actually where the Halifax Building Society were based. So they didn't know where the properties were. They had no idea of actually trying to manage their risk in any shape or form, and we didn't know how vulnerable they were. Now we have another problem. We still have a problem in the insurance industry, but we have too much capital, right? There's too much money poured in, because people think we understand what we're doing now. Now, whether we do or don't, I'll leave it to others to judge, but we are much better at it than we used to be. How have we got better at it? We got better at it by the appliance of science, to use an advert from a German car manufacturer, I think. We actually now have actually been engaged with academia and engineering to try and understand better the risks. So if you have an earthquake, how often does it happen? If it happens, how big is it going to be? Where's it going to be? Where is our exposure? Mostly talking about property, but now increasingly talking about people. For the property, where is it? What's it built of? How well maintained is it? What's it used for? And then very importantly, vulnerability. If this thing happens and this property or these people are in place, how are they going to be hurt? And how can we make it better? And how can we bring them back to health quickly? Now, insurance, though, is mostly, non-life insurance is a single-year thing. Okay, you buy a policy for a year. Be honest with you, most insurance companies don't really care too much about what's going to happen in 10 years' time. Most CEOs are only there for 5 years, all right? So it's a relatively short-term thing. Insurance pricing is based on what the perceived risk is for this coming year. And we do take into account climate change. We do take into account climate cycles. We do take into account things like the El Niño and La Niña phenomenon. But largely speaking, it's a single-year risk. We're not overly concerned with looking at what could happen in 10 years, what could happen in 50 years. But, okay, moving on to slow onset things. 4 years ago, I was fortunate enough to get involved with the African Risk Capacity. African Risk Capacity is a mutual insurance company owned by African governments, which provides drought cover to those governments on a parametric basis, which I'll come to in a minute. Now, to do this, they need to understand, again, what the risk is. And the risk is not just lack of rain for drought. It's actually when the rain is. You can have too much rain at the wrong time. You need to have the right amount of rain before you can plant, once you plant it and during the growing season. So it's not just quantum, it's timing. You need to understand the exposure. Same thing again. In this case, it's actually partly the crop type. So what crop are you planting and what type of, how much water does it need? But also the people. Who's going to be affected by this if something happens? It's not just the farmers. It's a broader society. People will stop sending their kids to school, for example, because they can't pay the money to pay the fees, which has an impact on society. So how can we look at the broader consequences of this? And then the vulnerability. So, okay, this thing happens, what's the impact going to be? Firstly on the crop, then on the people. And then what can we do to get around it? So the benefits of ARC, which is funded by donors, by the way, is to engage with countries to properly understand their risks, so kind of work out where their people are, what crops are being planted, understand more about actually help them develop contingency plans. If something goes wrong, where they're going to buy grain from, where they're going to get trucks to move people and water around, all this type of things. Make sure they're not competing with aid agencies for scarce resources. And if the event actually occurs, then payment is guaranteed if it triggers within, I think it's 14 days. And a study of Oxford University showed if you get $1 to somebody when they really need it immediately after the event, it's worth $4, which would typically at the end of a typical aid cycle, which may be 2, 3, 4 months after the event. So it's not just about saving lives. We're pretty good at saving lives for drought now. It's about saving livelihoods, saving economies, and helping economies come back, build back quicker. So, But there are problems with, and I'm sure my colleague over here might say in a minute, with things like this. One issue is actually that we do have to worry about, far more than we do for most tropical cyclone earthquake covers, for example, about long-term climatic effects. Because they are slow onset. So what happens if an El Nino event is developing? That will clearly have an impact in a particular country, both on the risk in that country at the time and potentially what happens going forward. Oops, I think I've got to go much quicker now. And also cost. Right, part of the cost is handled by mutualisation. We spread the risk across the countries. Insurance is actually, in the fundamentally amazingly communistic approach, sharing risk. So that the poor, the those that have the money subsidise those that need it. We actually need competition, that we need to place something out of competition. There are 45 reinsurers on ARC. Right, sorry, can you give me just 2 minutes? 45 reinsurers actually interested in ARC, all competing on price. Okay, so we can actually drive the price down, but subsidy is really important, and I'll come back to subsidy in just a minute. In terms of longer term stuff, there is now interest in I remember the Association of Small Island States coming to us about 5-6 years ago, and we say, oh no, we can't insure against sea level rise. It's going to happen. You can't insure against it. But it's not quite true. You can insure against things that are going to happen. You can insure against death, right? Everybody's going to die, but you can buy life insurance. It's all about timing. How quickly is it going to happen? So can we find a way that we can make people comfortable enough, they understand the risk, that they can begin to provide some kind of timing risk cover to do that? So that is actually, but to do that, we need to understand the risk better. We need to quantify the uncertainty. The more uncertainty there is, the higher price there will be. One interesting thing that's going on, we're talking about covers at the moment to look at things like reef blanching, protecting coral reefs, protecting mangrove swamps. And we're beginning to get to move from a position where I've always thought about insurance as being something which is used to incentivize good behavior and incentivize risk understanding. Now, this is my last sentence, now we're in a position where insurance is now becoming a reward, can be considered a reward for good behavior. So very often the insurance is packaged with the overall product. So if somebody is behaving well and continues to behave well, they get free or subsidized insurance. It's quite an interesting switch around, I think. Sorry, Chairman.
No worries, thank you so much. But you just have to bear in mind that you will have an opportunity to actually respond to a number of those questions. There are very targeted questions here, some to our respective panel members, and really exciting questions that are coming on to Slido. Please keep slidering those questions because it's going to be a very interesting discussion. Without further ado, Julianne, please. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Bulla. Welcome. I will be addressing the question about loss and damage exceeding national capacity or boundaries and thinking about it from a national point of view and from a global point of view. So perhaps to start very quickly with an example that's on everyone's mind right now, if we think about the hurricane that's just hit Dominica and obviously many other regions in the countries in the region, but looking at Dominica in particular, Hurricane Maria caused loss and damage to Dominica of roughly $500 million. The estimates vary between $500 million to $1 billion. $500 million is equal to 90% of Dominica's annual GDP. So they lost 90% of their GDP in one storm. It obviously had many, many other non-economic impacts as well. People being killed, people being displaced. Within the 6 years preceding that, Dominica suffered from Tropical Storm Erica in 2015, where it lost again roughly $500 million, almost all of its GDP in a year. Suffered from 2 extreme record level rains, floods and landslides, again causing huge amounts of damage. So we're already on the cusp of countries potentially being overwhelmed by loss and damage when it comes to climate change. One second very quick example comes from the droughts in East Africa at the moment. East Africa's seen a 3-decade drying trend, and now, obviously, at the moment, there have been 3 years of very low rainfall and very high temperatures, which have led to, for instance, loss and damage impacts like roughly 2 million people being forced to flee their homes in the Horn of Africa. This extreme drought comes again on the tail of another extreme drought only a few years ago. In this previous extreme drought from 2008 to 2011, the Kenyan government estimated that they suffered losses, or Kenya suffered losses from that drought of $12 billion. And those losses were overwhelmingly felt by the poorest and the most vulnerable people in Kenya, which then had a flow-on effect to the Kenyan government, who had to divert funds from projects that would otherwise spend on development to these poorest and most vulnerable people who were left with nothing. So we can see that loss and damage is already having an impact on vulnerable countries that may be overwhelming their capacity to develop and to develop and to bring their people out of poverty. When we look at that at a global scale, that's what I aim to do with this slide that's up now. We can see that loss and damage from climate change globally is moving us into a completely different era of need for finance for loss and damage. So what this graph represents is, on the left, current ODA that is provided, overseas development assistance or aid, which gets shifted around to things like disaster risk reduction finance, adaptation finance, international humanitarian assistance, which are all relevant for loss and damage. So on the left, you can see the current developed to developing country funds that flow. On the right, you can see some estimates of how much funds or finance we're going to need in 2030. 2030 is not very far away, but the scale is enormously different. So if we look at the needs to meet the finance needs to meet the Sustainable Development Goals, that's in blue, the finance needs to meet the adaptation needs estimates in red, and the estimates of loss and damage needs in green. Clearly, we are not in the ballpark right now with where we need to go for loss and damage finance and for the broader overall development finance that's going to be needed by developing countries. In this graph, I hope to represent that we need to stop tinkering around the edges. So the Warsaw International Mechanism was set up in 2013 with a clear mandate to enhance action and support. The 2CP19 actually says enhance or mobilise finance 3 times, and at no point does it use the term financial instrument. Yet, when the WIM ExCom talks about finance, it almost exclusively talks about financial instruments, and it almost exclusively talks about insurance. This graph I hope to represent in that we cannot fix this problem with insurance. We cannot fix this problem by thinking that we can tinker around the edges. We need to think very hard about how we're going to dig deep and have a completely different approach to funding loss and damage for developing and particularly most vulnerable developing countries. I want to be clear that insurance has a role to play in extreme events, but that role is limited. Even in extreme events, that role is limited, and I'd very happily take a question later on if someone wants to ask me that question about how insurance is limited even in extreme events. But when it comes to slow onset events, which we're talking about today, insurance is extremely unlikely to be the right response to those impacts. And whilst, final word on insurance, it's perhaps the most important thing to keep in mind about insurance is that vulnerable countries and people should not be paying for insurance premiums. These people did not cause climate change. There is no way we should be shifting the cost of dealing with climate change onto vulnerable people and communities by assuming that they are going to pay insurance premiums. Strategies and instruments that are more appropriate than insurance in the face of slow onset events are likely to focus on building the resilience of communities. And I think Manjeet's intervention earlier spoke to this. They're likely to include things like social protection schemes that can provide the certainty to allow better decision making in the face of risk. So at a very local level, if we look at an example, it might allow farmers to keep, a social protection scheme might allow farmers to keep seeds for the next season that they would otherwise be compelled to eat or sell. And then another example of a strategy or instrument that might be more appropriate is livelihood diversification. So we should think about programs like livelihood diversification in the face of loss and damage that will allow communities to, whilst still suffering loss and damage from climate change, yes, I can hear that, Bill,
I may have to cut you short now because we've only got 30 minutes, under 30 minutes, in fact, to have a discussion. So
can I do my concluding point? Yes.
Please.
Thank you. So it's crucial that the WIM turn to looking at how this finance might be generated from where we are now to where we need to go. And very important in that is to think about generating in the spirit of the Paris Agreement on a cooperative and facilitative basis and look at innovative or alternative sources of finance. One of those we have launched today in the Climate Damages Declaration, talking about a fossil fuel extraction fee or a climate damages tax. Others include international air passenger levies, levies on international aviation and shipping, and financial transaction taxes. Final note, it is very important that these levies, taxes, innovative sources of finance be implemented in a way that is consistent with the equity principles of the Convention, so in a way that's consistent with common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, of which we have many ideas how to do that. And I would direct you to both the Climate Damages Declaration that we released today and a report that I co-authored with Liana Shalatek in May that's called Financing Loss and Damage, a look at governance and implementation options for all of the many elements that we haven't had a chance to get to today.
Thank you so much for that intervention, Julianne. I think you raised some valid points in terms of it's not a cookie cutter option in terms of this insurance will be the solution. So I think now I really would like to open the floor. I have seen really exciting questions that are coming through in relation to, so if we're going to have some innovative financing mechanisms and options and direction, what do partnerships also look like in terms of doing this, what we're trying to do? One of the questions that, before I open the floor for anybody to put, do we have someone with a mic? Great. Okay, we've got someone with a mic over there. One of the questions that has come through is a question looking at to Simone in relation to the fund. So who is able to access this LDN fund mechanism and where is it located? So if you can just respond to that.
Yes, thank you. So the quick answer to that question is that anybody can access the fund or submit projects to consideration for financing to the fund. The fund itself is established in Luxembourg as an SPV SIV. Of course, the fund has adopted a number of investment targets and strategies, and therefore there are eligibility criteria, so it's not going to finance any type of projects. The financing will be in the forms of credits or loans and not grants. Another aspect to consider is that the project that is proposed should be profitable or bankable. In other words, it should, over a number of years, reach break-even and then generate a cash flow in terms of revenue. And also, I would say perhaps the most important aspect is that projects that are submitted to consideration to the fund need to demonstrate a positive contribution towards the target of land degradation neutrality, which is the policy angle or anchor on which the fund is established.
Thank you. There is a question that has come for Espen. And there was a question about the partnerships in the small island developing states. What do partnerships look like in the small island developing states in relation to slow onset event?
Okay, well, I guess the best example was in relation to the other question. That's the proposal that's been put forward by Tuvalu, which is now entitled the Pacific Islands Climate Change Insurance Facility. So this was an initiative by the Tuvalu Prime Minister, and he took it to the international. Well, he took it to the regional level first, but he also took it to the international level, and he requested SPREP and other partners to have a regional dialogue meeting. We were supported by UNDP in that effort. And David was actually there as one of the presenters. So it was quite a good example of how we do regional partnerships, in that we bring together all the countries in the region, but also we try and get the experts from within the region and also the experts from outside the region. And we try and leverage some support from friendly countries and agencies to fund it. But anyway, from that dialogue, we now have a much better understanding of what we can do now with what we have. We also have a better understanding of what we'll need to go under existing insurance cover, for example. But we've also got a great deal of further work that needs to be done. Pacific leaders have endorsed the proposal at their most recent summit, and the regional agencies are now being requested to carry out some of this work. So we need to engage some more expertise from outside the region, but we also need to have them work with the climate change experts that we do have in the region. So it's a work in progress, but I guess that's as good an example as I can give as how the region actually works together in partnership.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Espen. So I'd like to open the floor. If you can take maybe 3 questions. If they're directed to any particular individual, please, when you take the mic, introduce yourself and your affiliation, if you so wish, and ask the question directly. Oh, are people trying to be anonymous? Don't be afraid. Reactions, thoughts? There's a lady in the middle and there's one at the back, please. If you can just introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, Noemi de Lagos from S&P Global Ratings. Thanks a lot for all your comments, very interesting. I have a question for Simone. I was just wondering, what are the revenue streams or cash flows that provide returns to investors in your the mechanism that you've just described? Thank you.
So question is in relation to revenue streams. Okay, next question. There was a question at the back, please.
Hi, my name is Sujin Natson, and I'm a student at Oxford focusing on loss and damage and climate litigation. So my question is, what are the limitations of insurance schemes on slow onset events? And secondly, it's also, what are some examples of insurance schemes for non-economic loss and damage? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. Would like to hear the outcomes of your studies.
Hello, Colin McQuiston from Practical Action. I'd just like to highlight the excellent questions that are on the Slido board. I think this role of regulation, taxation, finance that can reach vulnerable people, and then finally, how can these social mechanisms help build social cohesion? So I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts on those questions from the Slido. Thank you.
Yes, I shall present the panel to actually review some of those questions and respond to them in just in a bit. We just wanted to hear your voices. Anyone last question? The lady in the middle? And then I'll pass on to the panel to respond.
Thank you very much. My name is Patience Damte. I'm from Ghana. My question is directed to the lady at the last end. I mean, you mentioned aviation taxes. I'm just wondering, because a lot of developing countries have airlines, how does it mean that we are going to pay for loss and damage by ourselves? Because if the taxes are there, then it means we are paying by ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you. Simone, revenue streams.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. So the fund has determined the average return that investors can expect, based, of course, on the market average at present. So this average return ranges, on the basis of the current situation on the market, between 3% and 8%. So this means that it has already envisaged different dividends to be paid to the investors depending on their respective profile. Some of the investors, as I mentioned earlier, would take junior shares. So this would be, for example, public donors. The government of Luxembourg, for example, has announced an investment of 5 million. Some of these investors will perhaps not even expect to receive a dividend. So any dividend will be reinvested into the fund. I think this is in short an answer to your question. And then, of course, the other side of it is the revenue streams that are generated by the underlying investment. So this, of course, is a broader portfolio depending on the type of project, be it a sustainable land management project, be it an agricultural, green agriculture project, or a renewable energy project. So it will be different returns on the basis of the specificity of that project. What is important for the fund is that as a portfolio, these various projects will enable the fund manager to deliver between 3 to 8% to its investors.
Thank you. There was a much broader question in terms of limitations. Any panel member or thoughts on that? Limitations before I go to Julianne. Please, David.
Right. For the question from the gentleman at the back. Firstly, I should say, actually, I don't disagree with much of what Julianne's said. In fact, probably most of what Julianne said. Insurance is not the solution to all these problems, but actually I would argue strongly it is part of the solution, though. One reason is actually the insurance mechanism does encourage, in fact, mandate risk understanding. You have to understand what the hell's going on better than you do at the moment. You have to understand risk behaviour, and you have to understand risk response. So the more we can actually understand and begin to study and quantify those things, the better the society will be. So, but it's, as far as slow onset stuff, it's actually much more difficult. It does also, of course, encourage great regional cooperation and regional understanding. Coming back to your question about examples of non-economic schemes, there are probably 3 major ones operational at the moment. One called CRIF, which is a Caribbean Catastrophe Risk Insurance Facility, one called ARC, African Risk Capacity, which I mentioned before, and one called PCRIC, Pacific Catastrophe Risk Insurance Company. Right? All those schemes provide emergency response money. They do not attempt to pay the full amount of damage. All they try to do is get money to a country quickly. I was at the World Bank Washington meetings a month ago. There's a group of prime ministers from the Caribbean governments in the room, all of them saying the importance of getting money quickly, knowing if they got a policy from CRIF, it may not be enough. And I come back to your point. The issue is actually they can't afford to buy much cover, and cover does need to be subsidised and does need to be funded by others. But if they do have a cover, they know within 3 days how much money is going to be coming, and they can therefore allocate that money to do things like clearing damage, restoring normality, pulling power back. Right? So all the things that get life back to normal again quickly can happen fast. But you're absolutely right. I mean, those kind of things. The thing is, this has to be part of a bigger solution. It's not going to be the ultimate answer.
Julianne, as you address the issue of the airline tax that was asked by patients from Ghana, please add on to this question, this other question that's just popped up on Slido looking at. Julianne, please, can you outline how climate damage tax could be utilized for slow onset disasters?
Great, thank you. So to start with, to address the question about if we're talking about innovative alternative sources of finance, are we expecting developing countries to pay for their own loss and damage? And I think it's a good question. It's important that the response to loss and damage be addressed within the equity parameters of the convention, which is that as I've said in my presentation earlier, poor and vulnerable people did not cause the problem of climate change, and we should not be seeking in our solutions to this to further shift cost onto them. And that includes vulnerable governments as well. So we need to be careful that the innovative and alternative sources of finance that we prosecute are designed in a way that can ensure that doesn't occur. So, for instance, I can't speak in much depth to the aviation levies, but I know that there are no net incidence principles that have been developed around aviation levies, or maritime bunker fuels, I should say. But when it comes to the climate damages tax, the way we propose that be dealt with is that a tax be applied at the point where fossil fuels are extracted, and depending on the level of development of the country, they would keep all or a portion of that tax to use domestically. And if it was a rich country, e.g. Australia, extracting fossil fuels, then a very large portion of that tax would go to the International Fund for Loss and Damage. So it would depend on the level of development of the country as to how much of that tax would be transmitted to the international fund, and therefore countries would be paying in line with their CBDRC. So that's how we deal with that there, and I'm happy to talk to you later about more granular responses to that. On the how
climate
the
damage
carbon
taxes.
it could help with slow onset effects. Essentially, as I tried to illustrate in that graph, we're going to need a lot of money. We are going to need developed countries to step up and to do things like meet their 0.7% of gross national income as ODA. We are going to need more South-South cooperation, and we are going to need to really seriously explore things like the climate damages tax, innovative sources of finance. And once we have those significant source of finance, we would say in an international fund managed by the WIM or a body that the WIM mandates to manage it, they would then be able to allocate funds to governments and to communities who come to them and say, we are suffering from a loss and damage impact. It might be a slow onset event. It might be something, e.g., the people of the Carteret Islanders in Papua New Guinea who are currently in the process of moving from the Carteret Islanders onto bigger, kind of the mainland of Papua New Guinea. They're not getting any international finance to do that. So the Carteret Islanders and the PNG government could go to the international fund and say, we actually need funds so that we can stay together as a community and relocate in a planned way. That might be an example of how a climate damages tax paid into an international fund would help with slow onset events.
Great, thank you. I know that, Manjeet, you actually talked about the issue of collaboration in terms of partnership within the Himalayan Hindu Kush region. How do you see these partnerships, particularly around having a sort of a coordinated dialogue, especially a transboundary coordinated dialogue?
Thank you. As I explained earlier, there is a very important role. There are some difficulties that within our country, that we are facing in terms of coordinating between the different institutions. But here, in terms of coordinating with the organization outside the countries, it's also very important to have an institution with the mandate to have the coordination. And here the coordination is not only about the addressing the impacts after something happens, but also the institution that can help in terms of the preparedness, in terms of planning, in terms of providing, in terms of knowledge generation and supporting the government to prepare for such kind of extreme or the slow onset event. And here also lies the role of the work that the EXCOM has been doing, which is one of the important functions. So I would call for the greater focus on that specific function, and also on highlighting on the third function that relates to mobilize action in this area. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great, mobilization of action. I shall put you on the spot, Mr. Birthday Man, since you're here. As an EXCOM member, how do you see in terms of sort of getting... We're now talking about innovative financing or finding sort of new financing mechanism. The discussions within EXCOM, how are those discussions actually now, other than just insurance, is there anything else that we need to be thinking about? There's a question on Slido to that effect.
Thanks. I think that's a very important question, particularly for the executive committee to be able to deliver on its mandate and on its function. So I think I will invite you to read the EXCOM report that we have just tabled before the parties, to consider some of the key elements, the progress of the work that has been done so far, and what are the key concerns. I think what is also very critical is to say, you can actually hear from the conversation that finance for loss and damage is very critical. Mm-hmm. And we need to go and look at the decisions that have made provisions to make sure that we can be able to enable the functionality of the executive committee for the WIM, and also for the WIM in terms of the operations of the WIM. So it's critical for us to be able to deal with those three key main functions of the WIM, and that will require financial resources to be able to articulate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. There's a question that's come anonymously. It says, in the Caribbean, can we actually spend risk financing in finding ways to build infrastructure that is less susceptible to extreme events? Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, yes, certainly. I mean, I think one thing you can do, and again, it does require some degree of external funding, probably, though. I mean, one issue you could do, for example, there's an initiative which is currently being discussed, funded by the US State Department, actually, which got through the pre-administration change, to try to build sustainable fisheries in the Caribbean. And that is another example where the insurance mechanism, which is part of the process, but one part of it is actually before a country is allowed to join the mechanism, they have to sign up to a sustainable fisheries policy, and actually then have to be seen to live by that sustainable fisheries policy. If they do so, then they get given effectively subsidised or perhaps even potentially free, it hasn't been decided, insurance against an event which actually could wipe out their fishing industry. But if that event occurs, then they don't necessarily just replace as is, they build back better, which may mean taking surplus capacity out of the system. It may be making that capacity which is left more resilient and less damage prone. And there's also been talked about potentially, if there's no loss, then the premium money is returned to the government to spend on resilience measures to improve society's resilience against the event before it occurs. So there are various ways which we could design these mechanisms. The trouble is, if you are, again, candidly, cost is always going to come back to this. If you're building in the price of building back better after an event or trying to encouragement to people to improve their buildings, like tying their roofs down, there are costs involved in that. And actually, who can afford to pay it? And we have to think, as a society, where those funds are coming from.
Right, we're almost drawing to the end of our discussions, but before we do, I think I just want some last thoughts from the panel members, and maybe there's some really pressing questions. Yes, the gentleman in the middle, please, if you can introduce yourself. The mic. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Harjeet Singh, and I'm from ActionAid International. We all know we are moving towards a 3-degree warmer world. I hope we won't finally. And sea level is rising faster than expected. So I would like to draw attention on the permanent and irreversible loss and damage. And I would like to understand, apart from a couple of financing streams that Julian talked about in terms of putting carbon levy or taxes, what other kind of financial instruments can be developed to fund planned relocation, especially of people who are facing permanent and irreversible loss and damage?
Thank you for that question. Thoughts from the panel, please, feel free. Yes, Espen.
We've done quite a bit of work on trying to understand the displacement issues, the migration issues under climate change scenarios. One of the key messages that we were given by our member countries was that displacement and forced migration is going to be so bad, we want to avoid it at all costs. And please help us negotiate to avoid a 3-degree world. But this is something, when you're talking about irreplaceable losses, we've had many examples of that in the Pacific. Cyclone Heta, when it hit Niue, it wiped out 95% of the National Museum. That's complete. There's nothing you can. It's so heart-wrenching, and there's absolutely nothing you can. No insurance could replace that. No financial payment could replace that. So it really is the strongest encouragement that we have in being in the negotiations is to just let's stick to the 1.5.
Thank you. Julianne, did I see your hand, please?
I think when it comes to dealing with irreversible and irreplaceable losses, almost the only approach is going to be an international fund where communities and countries can go to and seek assistance in dealing with those losses. It's not going to, as Espen said, in particularly in the case where they're non-economic losses, culture, loss of community cohesion. So we can try and, if we take loss and damage activities, we can try and minimise those loss of culture, loss of community cohesion, etc. We can do things like fund communities to do planned relocation rather than to do forced migration that is bad migration. So we can, if we have an international fund that communities and countries can access, then we can minimise suffering. So I think that maybe Do you want closing thoughts now? Or?
Closing thoughts now, please.
Okay, so closing
thoughts.
thoughts.
I'll ask the other panel members to have some thoughts as well.
Closing thoughts from me is that we need to not conflate loss and damage with suffering. Loss and damage activities can minimise suffering. They're still going to face loss and damage, but it's not necessarily suffering. And then final closing thought from me is that I think this panel has made it clear that finance is key. And so far, to date, the WIM XCOM has not lived up to the mandate that it's received. Out of the negotiations here, we need a 2-year work plan to develop how we're going to deal with finance, where we're going to get the money, how it's going to get to vulnerable communities and countries. And this COP is the COP to give the WIM and perhaps the SCF that mandate.
Thank you. Panel members, any other thoughts? Last thoughts?
I'll just rather repeat myself. A couple of things I've noted down which I don't think have come up, have been alluded to in the conversation. One of the benefits, I think, of a regional insurance scheme is actually a matter of, as we talked about in the Pacific, is actually local ownership. It may not be totally local funding, but local ownership of risk. People actually think they're doing something, can do something for themselves, as much as they can do, but also then relying on the expertise and the funding of third parties. An insurance mechanism, it can, by kind of understanding risk better, actually provide a way of regularising donor funding as well. So rather than donors responding to events, and very often when the call goes out for money is promised, not all that money arrives. When that money does arrive, it arrives late. Right? If you actually have a pot of money sitting there ready to be deployed as soon as a known event occurs, which can be an insurance pot, it could actually just be a contingency pot, to be honest with you. There's great, now the countries have greater certainty and the donors actually know what they're doing. And I think one quick example of society, there's a question on the board actually, which is quite an interesting one.
30 seconds from each panel.
It will be 30 seconds. And looking at actually how can society as a whole benefit from such schemes. One interesting example is a lot of talk at the moment about protection of reefs. The main damage to reefs actually isn't things like sea surface, sea temperature warming or acidification. It's probably local runoff, pollution from the country. If you can actually get people to take ownership of the pollution risk and then reward them with providing cover against the things they can't control, then it's a double win situation. And if those people's livelihood is dependent on fisheries, dependent on tourism, then they have certainty in their lives. So I think it has to be a partnership. It cannot be an outsourced problem.
Thank you.
Just a quick one, just to follow up on Julianne's point about the WIM. WIM needs to result in helping us get some practical solutions, practical actions on the ground. This means they need to be a catalyst for innovation, adapting technologies and techniques. They need to help us get that capacity supplementation support, and we need to get financing that's not tied to the whims of the multilateral development banks.
Thank you.
Thanks, very brief. Quick point. The role of the regional or the international institutions are very important. The best example would be the SPREP, the way has been mandated in terms of doing activities at the different level that I highlighted earlier. Funding is very important, it's crucial, and also these are the countries who need funding, who have least capacity to access. So the funding with the simple access modality, and very important, there should also be a forum to have a continuous debate, also feeding information from the latest science, and that's what the LDC group has been calling here in terms of having the standing agenda on loss and damage. Thank you.
Thank you. Grammenos?
Yeah, thank you. Throughout the panel, I've been looking intently to one question, which was how can financial instruments help build social cohesion so vulnerable people are better prepared and less impacted? I think this is a crucial question, and we have to understand it if we look again at what are low onset events. Some of the reasoning, which is normal because it comes, is about the moment in which these events, although they're slow, have been consumed and the damage is permanent and things. But in our perception, the role of finance, the really constructive role of finance, is in the transition phase. Right. Why? Because in this transition phase, the transformation of nature can be turned into an opportunity. And how can it become a social cohesion mechanism? Because, well, I will have to use a language which belongs to development people. It's about empowerment. A finance that empowers people into making their own, out of their own environment and of its change, an income opportunity is also a finance that builds social cohesion and makes everyone, not only structures, but also people prepared for what will come in terms of permanent and definitive damage.
Right. Simone.
Thank you. Very, very quickly, I just would like to add a word of optimism to the executive committee, because I think this panel has shown that there are examples out there and experiences and instruments that demonstrate that resources, financial instruments can be mobilized for SOEs. We were facing this challenge ourselves. Nobody believed that there would be private sector investors interested in land degradation or desertification. This is not true. So solutions are out there, and we would be very much willing to collaborate on finding a solution for SOEs.
Great.
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the different final takes. Yes, we do welcome the different collaboration with the different institutions. Allow me to say we have the WIM mechanism, and as it is a binding mechanism and it's a country-driven process whereby all the parties have agreed to build such or to establish such mechanism, I think it's important for us to make that mechanism work. I think it's important for us to make sure that the mandate of that particular mechanism is delivered, and also to make sure that the functions are delivered so that we can be able to address the impacts of a loss and damage. And this is very important across, whether you're in a developed state, whether you're in a developing country, whether you're in a small island state, the impacts of loss and damage knows no boundaries, and we've heard and we've seen it from the presentations today. We have the WIM Executive Committee. The WIM to function, it needs your support, technical support, financial support, and otherwise. We have heard that there's a need for financial support for the WIM Executive Committee to function, and also for the WIM itself to be able to carry its mandate. So we really need to work on that. In terms of the practical solutions, we welcome the collaboration with different organizations to make sure that we can be able to share the experiences, and also importantly to be able to change the lives of the many people. When it's lost and damaged, it's difficult to be able to retrieve it. So are we sure that we're going to be able to get back, bounce back to where we have been? And that's not easy. So we've seen the frequent events, intents that are happening. So we have a mandate, help us to achieve the mandate, support us in achieving that particular mandate, and also we need to take the responsibility of our actions and the decisions that we are making as we move on from here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And on that note, happy birthday again. We were going to sing happy birthday for you, but it's 3 minutes over the time. But I really want to thank everyone in this room. Please, let's give an applause to the presenters and to yourselves. And enjoy the rest of your afternoon. We're going to consolidate a lot of these questions, and some of them will be on the website. Thank you.